1943, London. 17-year-old Eliza Hastings has learned to make herself invisible in her own home. Each bruise is a lesson, each lash of her father's belt another reminder that silence is survival. Behind closed doors, his cruelty knows no limits, but it's the secrets he keeps about her missing brother that truly haunt her nights. When American soldier Thomas Jenkins arrives at their doorstep, something in his eyes tells Eliza he knows more than he reveals. The way he watches her father with barely concealed hatred, the way he notices the bruises she tries to hide. Most disturbing of all, the way he glances at the hiding place where she keeps her letters to a brother everyone claims is dead. As tension builds in the small house, Eliza discovers shocking evidence that will shatter everything she thought she knew about her family. What really happened to her beloved brother James? Why does her father's rage grow more dangerous by the day? And most importantly, is Thomas Jenkins here to save her? Or is he carrying secrets that could destroy what remains of her shattered family forever? The sound of her father's belt whistled through the air before it struck Eliza's back, each lash leaving invisible scars that ran deeper than the fading welts on her pale skin. She bit her lower lip until she tasted copper, a ritual of silence she'd perfected over 17 years. One tear escaped despite her determination, tracing a warm path down her cheek before disappearing into the threadbare collar of her dress. The floorboards beneath her knees had grown polished from similar afternoons, when his rage found excuse in burned porridge or a misplaced newspaper. "This is what happens when you write those pathetic letters," her father growled, his breath heavy with the sour stench of homemade spirits that had become his religion since the war began. He held up a crumpled paper, her latest attempt to reach her brother, gone now for 8 months. "You think anyone cares? You think he's even alive?" The word alive hitched in his throat, something dark flickering behind his bloodshot eyes that made Eliza's stomach twist with unease. He knew something about her brother that he wasn't saying. Eliza's fingers twitched involuntarily, a nervous habit that betrayed her inner turmoil. She watched as her father stuffed the unfinished letter into his pocket rather than destroying it as he usually did. The peculiarity of this action sent a ripple of cold dread through her chest. Her father always burned her letters. Always. Why keep this one? London, 1943, existed in permanent twilight. Blackout curtains shrouded windows throughout their neighborhood, transforming homes into anonymous shadows after dusk. The familiar wail of air raid sirens punctuated life with metronomic regularity, dividing time into moments of breath held and released. Their house still bore scars from last year's bombing, a ceiling crack that spiderwebbed across her bedroom, leaking dampness when it rained. The walls themselves seemed to absorb the ambient anxiety, exhaling it in musty waves that made the air perpetually thick. "Go prepare dinner," her father muttered, collapsing into his armchair, the springs protesting beneath his weight. He stared at the silent radio as if it might suddenly offer salvation. His hands, once strong and sure when he worked at the factory before the war, now trembled slightly, betraying a weakness he despised in himself and punished in others. "And don't think I've forgotten about that window you didn't black out properly yesterday," the air warden noticed. "Made me look like I can't control my own house." In the kitchen, Eliza methodically peeled potatoes, the monotonous action allowing her thoughts to wander to James, her brother. Her heartbeat quickened as she pictured his kind eyes, so unlike their father's. James had promised to return, swearing on their mother's grave that he would come back for her 18th birthday. Just 4 more months, she whispered to herself, the knife slipping momentarily and nicking her thumb. A bright bead of blood welled up, hypnotizing in its perfect symmetry. Beneath the loose floorboard in her room, Eliza kept 17 unsent letters, one for each month since James had left for the front. She wrote religiously, recording the small horrors of living with their father, the increasing bruises, the mysterious phone calls that left him agitated and drinking more heavily. In her most recent letter, she'd written about her suspicion that her father was involved in something dangerous. "The men who visit when they think I'm asleep," she'd written, "they don't speak like soldiers. They speak like men who profit from war." The sudden hammering at the front door made Eliza drop the potato she was holding. Her father's chair creaked as he stood, muttering curses. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see his silhouette hesitate before reaching the entrance, his hand lingering unusually at his waistband, where he kept the small pistol he thought she didn't know about. "Hastings residence?" her father barked, opening the door just enough to reveal a slice of the world outside. Eliza strained to hear the response, but caught only murmurs. Her father's posture changed instantly, his shoulders stiffening, his voice dropping to a controlled hush that she recognized from his most dangerous moods. "Come in then," he said finally, stepping back to admit the visitor. "But this arrangement is temporary." "Understood?" Eliza pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering against her ribs. From her position, she could see only a military boot, muddied and worn, stepping over their threshold. The boot belonged to a leg that moved with a pronounced limp. "My daughter will prepare a place for you to sleep," her father continued, his voice carrying an undercurrent she'd never heard before. Not anger, but something closer to fear. "Eliza, come here now." She moved as if underwater, each step requiring conscious effort. When she entered the hallway, the stranger's eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. He was American. His uniform gave that away immediately, but it was the recognition in his gaze that froze her in place. He looked at her as if he knew her, as if he'd read every letter she'd ever written to James. "This is Private Thomas Jenkins," her father said, his knuckles white around the doorknob. "The military has requested we provide him lodging while he recovers from his injuries." The words sounded rehearsed, each one carefully measured. The American's gaze flickered to the fading bruise on Eliza's cheekbone, then back to her eyes. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, with a slight nod that somehow contained both deference and promise. Her father's hand suddenly gripped her shoulder, fingers digging into the fresh welts beneath her dress. She didn't flinch, wouldn't give him the satisfaction, but Thomas noticed. Something dangerous flashed across his features before he carefully composed his expression. "Show our guest to the spare room," her father ordered, his voice dropping to a whisper as he added, "And remember, these walls hear everything." As Eliza turned to lead the American upstairs, she caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He wasn't looking at her, but at her father, with the calm, measured assessment of a man calculating exactly how much force it would take to break another man's neck. The spare room had remained untouched since James left, a shrine of dust and fading memories that Eliza maintained despite her father's demands to stop living in the past. Now, as she pulled back the blackout curtains to let in the anemic afternoon light, the American soldier's presence filled the space with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Private Thomas Jenkins set his small duffel bag on the floor with deliberate care, as if it contained something fragile or dangerous. His movements were measured, efficient, the economy of motion that came from military training or perhaps from pain. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his accent distinctly Midwestern, vowels stretched like warm taffy. The formality felt strange to Eliza. No one had ever called her ma'am before. His gaze swept the room, cataloging details with an intensity that seemed more purposeful than casual curiosity. When his eyes settled on James's bookshelf, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation. "Dinner will be at 6, she said, the words feeling inadequate in the charged silence between them. "My father expects punctuality." She found herself unconsciously rubbing her wrist where yesterday's grip had left 5 perfectly formed fingerprints beneath her sleeve. Thomas nodded, his attention now fixed on a photograph of James in his uniform. "Your brother?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. When Eliza nodded, he added, "You look alike." Same eyes. Downstairs, her father's heavy footsteps paced the worn floorboards. 3 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause, a caged predator contemplating his next move. Eliza tensed at the sound, a Pavlovian response she couldn't control. Thomas noticed, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "I should help with dinner," she said, retreating toward the door, away from the unsettling perception in the soldier's gaze. "Miss Hastings," Thomas called softly as she reached the threshold. She turned, one hand still on the doorknob. "Some wounds don't show on the outside." The statement hung between them, ambiguous enough to deny any specific meaning, yet precise enough that Eliza felt momentarily dizzy, as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. The kitchen offered familiar refuge. Eliza moved through the ritual of dinner preparation, the mindless chopping and stirring allowing her thoughts to circle back to the stranger upstairs. There was something in the way he looked at her father, not with the deference most showed to Mr. Hastings, whose local reputation as a strict disciplinarian earned him a certain fearful respect. No. Thomas looked at him with the cool assessment of someone taking measurements for a coffin. The pot of soup bubbled on the stove, the scent of cabbage and too little meat filling the kitchen. Rationing had reduced their meals to bland approximations of nourishment, but Eliza had become adept at stretching ingredients, at finding flavor in scarcity. She set the table for 3, the addition of an extra place setting disrupting 5 years of practiced routine. At precisely 6 o'clock, her father emerged from his study, face flushed from whatever was in the flask he quickly pocketed. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs a moment later, descending with a slight but noticeable limp. His uniform had been exchanged for civilian clothes that hung awkwardly on his frame, as if borrowed or hastily acquired. "Sit," her father commanded, not looking at either of them as he took his place at the head of the table. The chair legs scraped against the floor, the sound scraping equally against Eliza's nerves. The meal commenced in suffocating silence. The only sounds were the clink of spoons against bowls, and her father's occasional grunt of displeasure at the soup's inadequacy. Thomas ate methodically, his eyes rarely leaving his bowl except for brief, deliberate glances at Eliza and her father. The tension between the two men crackled like static electricity before a lightning strike. Eliza reached for the bread basket, her sleeve riding up just enough to reveal the edge of a purple bruise blooming across her forearm. Thomas's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixing on the discolored skin with an intensity that made her stomach clench. She tugged her sleeve down quickly, but the damage was done. He had seen, and his jaw tightened with barely contained emotion. The silence between them spoke volumes. Her shame, his anger, the shared knowledge that remained unspoken. Thomas's fingers whitened around his spoon handle, and for a terrifying moment, Eliza thought he might say something. "Weather's turning," her father interrupted harshly, his voice scraping through the silence like a rusty nail. "Radio says we might get fog tonight. Bad for the bombers." He emphasized the last word while staring directly at Thomas, a challenge embedded in the statement. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice neutral but his eyes hard as flint. "Weather affects a lot of things in wartime." Something passed between the men then, a current of mutual understanding that excluded Eliza entirely. Her father's nostrils flared slightly, and Thomas's posture stiffened, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for impact. They knew each other, or knew of each other, Eliza was certain now. This was no random billeting arrangement. After dinner, Thomas offered to help with the dishes, an overture her father dismissed with a curt wave. "My daughter handles the household duties," he said, the implication clear. Boundaries were to be maintained. Left alone in the kitchen, Eliza methodically cleaned, the mechanical task allowing her mind to wander. What had brought Thomas Jenkins specifically to their door? What connection did he have to her father, to James? Questions swirled like soap bubbles in the dishwater, fragile and iridescent with possibility. When she finished, she climbed the stairs quietly, avoiding the third step that always creaked. As she passed the spare room, she noticed Thomas standing at the window, his silhouette outlined against the blackout curtains he'd drawn aside just enough to peer out at the darkening street. "Looking for something?" she asked softly, surprising herself with her boldness. Thomas turned, his face half in shadow. "Always," he replied cryptically, then, nodding toward her room, "You write to him often? Your brother?" The question sent ice through Eliza's veins. How could he possibly know about her letters? She'd never mentioned them. Her gaze instinctively flicked to her bedroom door, behind which, beneath a loose floorboard in her closet, lay the 17 letters she'd written to James. Thomas followed her gaze, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more complex. Recognition mingled with alarm, as if he'd confirmed something he'd hoped wasn't true. For a heartbeat, naked fear flashed across his features before he masked it with a careful neutrality. "Good night, Miss Hastings," he said, retreating into his room before she could respond. Eliza stood frozen in the hallway, the weight of unasked questions pressing against her chest. How did Thomas know where she kept her letters? What else did he know? And most disturbingly, why did the discovery seem to frighten him? Sleep evaded Eliza like a skittish animal, darting just beyond her grasp whenever exhaustion nearly claimed her. The house creaked and settled around her, each sound amplified in the darkness. Her father's snores from down the hall, the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns that had become London's nightly lullaby, the whisper of her own racing thoughts. 3 days had passed since Thomas Jenkins had arrived, and she'd made a deliberate effort to avoid him, taking her meals early or late, slipping through doorways when she heard his approach, keeping her eyes averted on the rare occasions when proximity was unavoidable. Yet despite her precautions, she felt his presence acutely, as if the air itself had changed density with his arrival. When they did accidentally meet in the narrow hallway or passing on the stairs, something electric arced between them, a recognition that transcended their brief acquaintance. It terrified and compelled her in equal measure. Tonight, restlessness propelled her from beneath her thin blankets. The clock on her bedside table read 3:17, that liminal hour when night begins its reluctant surrender to morning. Wrapping her threadbare robe tightly around her frame, she padded barefoot toward the kitchen, craving the comfort of tea, of warmth cradled between her palms. The soft glow of candlelight spilling from beneath the kitchen door stopped her cold. Her father never woke before 6, his schedule as rigid as his temperament. Heart accelerating, she pushed the door open with tentative fingers, revealing Thomas seated at the kitchen table, his back to her. Before him lay an open letter, her letter, in her unmistakable handwriting. "How dare you?" she whispered, the words escaping before caution could catch them. Her hands trembled, partly from anger, partly from the violation of having her private thoughts exposed to this stranger. "Those are private. How did you find them?" Thomas didn't startle at her voice, as if he'd been expecting her. He turned slowly, his face carved with shadows in the candlelight. The letter remained open before him, its pages translucent where tears had once dried. "I wasn't looking for them," he said softly, his American accent rolling the words together like smooth stones. "I was looking for proof." Proof of what? The floor beneath her bare feet felt suddenly unstable, the familiar kitchen transforming into unknown territory. Thomas gestured to the chair across from him, his movements deliberate, careful. "Please sit down, Miss Hastings." Something in his tone, not commanding but beseeching, made her comply. "I knew I'd find you tonight. Nights like these, when the guns are active, they keep soldiers awake, present and former alike." Eliza's fingers curled around the edge of the table, anchoring herself. "You had no right to read my letters," she persisted, though her voice had lost some of its conviction. "No, I didn't," he agreed surprisingly, "but your brother would have wanted me to." The mention of James hit her like physical contact, driving the air from her lungs. "You knew him," she breathed, the anger in her chest transmuting instantly to desperate hope. "You really knew James?" Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Knew him, fought alongside him, shared cigarettes and foxholes and nightmares with him." He reached inside his shirt, withdrawing a battered metal lighter engraved with initials J.H. that Eliza recognized instantly. "He gave me this the night before our last mission, said it was his good luck charm." Eliza's throat constricted painfully around unformed words. The lighter had been a gift from their mother, given to James on his 16th birthday, 2 weeks before influenza claimed her. He'd carried it everywhere, even though he didn't smoke. "You were there," she managed finally, her voice a fragile thing that threatened to shatter. "You were with him when he disappeared." "Not disappeared," Thomas corrected gently. "That's the official story, the convenient story." His fingers traced the embossed initials on the lighter, a gesture that spoke of habit. "We were assigned to a special reconnaissance mission, intelligence gathering behind German lines. James was selected because of his German language skills. I was his spotter." A cold weight settled in Eliza's stomach. James had learned German from their mother, who'd emigrated from Munich before the Great War. It was their secret language, the one they used when they needed words their father couldn't understand. "What happened?" she whispered, uncertain if she truly wanted the answer. Thomas's eyes clouded with memory. "We were compromised. Someone knew our position, our extraction plan, everything." His jaw tightened. James realized it first. He said someone had sold us out. There was only one person who had all the details of our mission outside of command. "Who?" The question hung between them like smoke. "Your father," Thomas said simply, the words falling like stones into still water. Eliza shook her head reflexively, denial rising like bile in her throat. "No, that's impossible. My father is many things, but he couldn't." But even as she protested, fragments of memory aligned. Her father's late-night meetings, hushed phone conversations in German that he didn't know she understood, the sudden influx of cash despite rationing, the timing of James's last letter before communication ceased. "James suspected for months," Thomas continued, his voice gentle as if easing her toward an inevitable conclusion. "The leaked intelligence always originated from your father's department. Small things at first, supply routes, rotation schedules, then bigger, troop movements, operation details." "If what you're saying is true," Eliza countered, desperation edging her words, "why would he betray his own son? It makes no sense." "I don't think he knew James would be on that particular mission. The assignments were classified last minute." Thomas hesitated, then added, "Or perhaps he did know, and that's what's eating him alive now." Eliza remembered her father's escalating violence since James's disappearance, the drinking, the haunted look that sometimes crossed his face when James's name was mentioned. Not grief, she realized now, but guilt. Her fingers unconsciously traced the fading bruise on her arm, the marks he'd left as if transferring his self-loathing onto her skin. "Why are you here?" she asked, the true question finally surfacing. "If you believe my father betrayed your unit, betrayed his own son, why come to this house? Why not report him?" Thomas's gaze dropped to the letter before him. "Because of these," he said, tapping the page gently. "Because James made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find you, protect you." His voice roughened. "And because without proof, no one will believe an American private's accusations against a British intelligence officer with 20 years' service." "And you think the proof is here, in this house?" "I know it is," Thomas replied, certainty hardening his features. "Your brother wasn't just gathering intelligence on German positions. He was building a case against your father. He sent me copies of some of the evidence before our last mission. Insurance, he called it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your brother didn't disappear by accident. Your father knows more than he's saying." The words struck Eliza like physical blows. The room seemed to tilt and spin around her, the foundations of her world crumbling beneath the weight of revelation. Her father, the monster who had tormented her for years, whose cruelty she had endured believing it was her burden alone, was not just her personal nightmare, but a traitor whose actions had cost countless lives. Perhaps even James's life. "Is my brother dead?" she asked. The question that had haunted her for 8 months finally given voice. Thomas's expression softened with compassion. "I don't know," he admitted. "We were separated during the ambush. Gunfire, chaos. I took a bullet in my leg, managed to crawl back to Allied lines. James was covering my retreat, but then..." He shook his head. "The official report lists him as missing in action, presumed dead, but without a body." Hope, that most dangerous of emotions, flickered in Eliza's chest. "You think he might still be alive?" "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that your father received a phone call 3 weeks ago that changed everything. After months of hearing nothing about James, suddenly he's making arrangements to house an American soldier with a connection to his son. That's not coincidence." Morning light slanted through the kitchen window, catching dust motes that danced in the air like miniature constellations. Eliza's fingers trembled slightly as she poured her father's tea, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the cup's rim. She hadn't slept after her midnight conversation with Thomas, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. The weight of knowledge pressed against her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Her father sat at the table, newspaper crisp between his fingers, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to fracture. "Father," she began, her voice steadier than she'd anticipated. The word felt strange in her mouth, formal and distant. She rarely addressed him directly anymore, having learned that invisibility was often her best defense. "I need to ask you something about James." The newspaper lowered a fraction, just enough to reveal eyes suddenly sharp with suspicion. "What about him?" Something dangerous lurked beneath the measured calm of his question, a tripwire waiting to be triggered. "Did you know about his last mission?" The words hung in the air between them, deceptively simple yet loaded with accusation. The newspaper crumpled as his fingers tightened reflexively. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Once, twice, the only outward sign of disturbance in his otherwise stone-like composure. "What has that American been telling you?" He didn't raise his voice. He never did at first. The quiet was always the prelude to the storm. Eliza's pulse hammered in her throat, but she pressed on, Thomas's revelations giving her a courage she'd never possessed before. "He says you knew, that you were passing information to the Germans, that James was tracking you." Each word felt like stepping further onto thin ice, hearing the ominous cracking underfoot. For 3 heartbeats her father remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. Then, with a swift, violent movement, he slammed his palm against the table. The teacup jumped, spilling amber liquid across the white tablecloth, a spreading stain like old blood. "You dare," he hissed, rising slowly from his chair. "You dare bring these lies into my house?" Eliza stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Are they lies? Thomas was there. He fought beside James. He knows nothing. Her father's voice erupted now, filling the small kitchen, his face flushed crimson, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. "That American has filled your head with filth. Your brother," he spat the word like something rotten, "your precious James was a coward who abandoned his post." "I don't believe you." Eliza's defiance surprised even herself. Her father moved with shocking speed for a man his age, crossing the kitchen in 2 strides. His fingers dug into her upper arms, lifting her partially off the ground so that her face was level with his. His breath washed over her, hot and sour with yesterday's whiskey. "Your brother betrayed his country," he snarled, spittle landing on her cheek. "He abandoned his mission. He abandoned you. But you're too stupid, too blindly devoted to see it." He shook her once, hard enough that her teeth clicked together painfully. "And now you believe some American stranger over your own father?" Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, not from pain, but from the terrible doubt his words had planted. What if Thomas was lying? What if James had truly deserted? The uncertainty made her nauseous. "You're hurting me," she whispered. "Hurting you?" He laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "You ungrateful little—" He released her suddenly, causing her to stumble backward against the counter. "Get out of my sight, and stay away from that American. He's not what he seems." Eliza fled, tears blurring her vision as she pushed through the back door into the small garden. The morning air was cool against her heated skin, the scent of damp earth and the neighbors' roses offering a momentary reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. She sank onto the stone bench beside her mother's withered herb garden, hands pressed against her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to escape. Minutes or hours later, she couldn't tell, a shadow fell across her hunched form. Eliza looked up to find Thomas standing there, his expression grave. She hadn't heard him approach, a remnant of his military training perhaps. He said James was a coward, she said without preamble, voice raw from suppressed crying. That he abandoned his mission. Abandoned me. Thomas lowered himself carefully onto the bench beside her, his injured leg extended awkwardly. "Your brother," he said, each word precise and measured, "was the bravest man I ever knew, and he never, not for 1 second, abandoned you." "Then what happened?" Eliza turned to face him fully. "Tell me everything, please." Thomas exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the overgrown garden, as if seeing something beyond the tangled vegetation. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. It's too dangerous, for you and for me. His hand moved unconsciously to his wounded leg. What I can tell you is that James was involved in something bigger than a standard reconnaissance mission. He was collecting evidence, building a case against my father. It wasn't a question anymore. Yes. Thomas's voice dropped lower. Your brother discovered a network of informants passing Allied intelligence to the Germans. High-level stuff, operation details, troop movements, supply lines. Information that got good men killed. His jaw tightened. The evidence pointed to someone in your father's department, someone with access to classified materials. And James thought it was my father? The idea still seemed impossible, despite everything. He had proof, Thomas said simply. Or at least he thought he did. Documents, recorded conversations, financial transactions that couldn't be explained by an intelligence officer's salary. He hesitated. But the final piece, the smoking gun that would have confirmed everything beyond doubt, that's what we were after on our last mission. Eliza's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory. Her father's unexplained absences, the mysterious visitors late at night, the new wireless set that appeared despite rationing restrictions, his insistence that she never answer the telephone or the door. What was the mission? What were you looking for? A ledger, Thomas replied. Records of payments, dates, specific intelligence that was sold, names of German handlers. His eyes met hers directly. James believed it would expose not just your father, but an entire network of traitors embedded within British intelligence. The revelation landed like a physical weight on Eliza's shoulders. This was bigger than her father's cruelty, bigger even than James's disappearance. This was treason on a scale that had shaped the course of the war itself. Is that why you're here? She asked. To find this ledger? Thomas nodded slowly. Among other reasons. Your brother trusted me, and before our last mission, he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find a way to protect you and finish what he started. His hand moved tentatively toward hers, stopping just short of contact. I think the ledger is hidden somewhere in this house. Your father's too smart to destroy evidence that valuable. It's his only insurance if things go wrong. And my brother, do you think he's really dead? The question that had haunted her for 8 months finally given voice. I don't know, Thomas admitted, his expression softening. But your father knows more than he's saying. That much I'm certain of. That evening, unable to face her father across the dinner table, Eliza claimed a headache and retreated to her room. The house settled into its nighttime rhythms, floorboards creaking as her father made his rounds, checking locks and blackout curtains, water rushing through old pipes as Thomas used the bathroom, then silence, broken only by the distant thrum of aircraft overhead. Just after midnight, the telephone rang. Eliza, still fully dressed and wide awake, froze at the sound. 1 ring, 2, then the soft shuffle of her father's slippers in the hallway below. She crept to her door, opening it just enough to hear his voice drift up the stairwell. Hastings speaking. A pause. Yes, I understand. No, there haven't been any complications. Another longer pause. The American knows nothing concrete, just suspicions. Her father's voice dropped lower, forcing Eliza to hold her breath to hear. James's name came up, yes, but I've handled it. The final words sent ice through her veins. No, there won't be any traces. I'll see to it personally. The Hastings house transformed in the days that followed, its familiar contours warping into something hostile and strange. Silence hung in the rooms like toxic gas, punctuated only by the creaking of floorboards as its inhabitants circled one another with wary vigilance. Eliza moved through her daily routines as if navigating a minefield, hyper-aware of her father's shifting moods, of Thomas's protective presence, of the dangerous knowledge they now shared. Her father's eyes followed her constantly, cold and calculating. He'd taken to coming home unexpectedly during the day, appearing in doorways without warning, his sudden presence causing her heart to stutter with alarm. When he spoke, his words were clipped, precise, revealing nothing while demanding everything. Where have you been? He would ask when she returned from simple errands. Who did you speak with? Each question delivered with the clinical detachment of an interrogator. Thomas, too, had changed. His initial cautious friendliness hardened into something more vigilant. He positioned himself strategically throughout the house, at the bottom of the stairs when her father's voice raised, in the garden when she hung laundry, his casual posture belied by the alertness in his eyes. They rarely spoke directly now, communicating instead through glances, subtle nods, the silent language of conspirators. On Thursday morning, Eliza dropped a plate while washing dishes, the crash of breaking china slicing through the tense quiet. Her father appeared instantly in the kitchen doorway, as if he'd been waiting for just such a misstep. "Clumsy girl," he hissed, crossing the space between them in 3 quick strides. His fingers dug into her upper arm, twisting the skin painfully as he yanked her away from the sink. "Can't even manage the simplest tasks without making a mess." "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology automatic, ingrained by years of placating his temper. "It was an accident." "An accident," he echoed, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet she knew too well. His grip tightened, fingernails breaking skin. "Like your brother's disappearance, like the American turning up on our doorstep. So many accidents in this house lately." The kitchen door creaked open behind them. "Everything all right in here?" Thomas stood framed in the doorway, his posture casual, but his eyes hard as flint. Her father released her instantly, his expression smoothing into pleasant neutrality with practiced ease. "Just a broken dish? Nothing to concern yourself with, Private Jenkins." The emphasis he placed on Thomas's rank carried a subtle reminder. "You are a subordinate here. I could help clean up," Thomas offered, his gaze never leaving her father's face. "My daughter is quite capable," her father replied coldly. "She's just distracted lately. Aren't you, Eliza?" His smile didn't reach his eyes, perhaps spending too much time entertaining our guest instead of focusing on her responsibilities. The accusation hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken threats. Eliza felt her cheeks flush, whether from anger or fear she couldn't tell. "I'll clean it up," she said quickly, dropping to her knees to gather the broken china. Her father nodded once, satisfied with his display of authority, then turned to Thomas. "You received a telephone call while you were out. Your commanding officer. He requested you contact him immediately." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Something about your extended convalescence leave." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but Eliza caught the subtle tensing of his shoulders. "Thank you, sir. I'll see to it right away." After both men left the kitchen, Eliza remained kneeling among the broken pieces of china, her hands trembling. The plate was from her mother's wedding set, one of the few things left of her. One more precious thing destroyed in this house of secrets and lies. That night, her father's brutality escalated without warning or provocation. Dinner had passed in strained silence, the only sounds the scrape of cutlery against plates and the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. As Eliza gathered the dishes, her father seized her wrist, examining the watch she wore. Her mother's watch, the last gift from James before he left. "Where did you get the money for this?" he demanded, though he knew perfectly well its origin. "It was Mother's," Eliza replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "James gave it to me before he—" The slap came without warning, the crack of palm against cheek echoing in the small dining room. "Don't lie to me," he snarled, his face contorted with sudden rage. "You've been stealing from me, sneaking around behind my back with that American." Thomas was on his feet instantly, chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough," he said, voice low but commanding. Her father turned slowly, a terrible smile spreading across his face. "Defending her honor, Private? How gallant." He released Eliza's wrist, stepping toward Thomas with deliberate menace. "I wonder what your superiors would think about your interest in my 17-year-old daughter." "My interest," Thomas replied evenly, "is in making sure an innocent girl isn't abused in her own home." "Innocent?" Her father laughed, the sound brittle and hollow. "You know nothing about my daughter or what she's capable of." He turned back to Eliza, looming over her. "Go to your room. I need to have a private conversation with our guest." Eliza hesitated, afraid to leave Thomas alone with her father. "Now," he barked, hand raised threateningly once more. She retreated, but only as far as the hallway, where she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear their conversation. Your recovery seems remarkably complete, her father was saying, his tone conversational now, all trace of anger expertly concealed. I wonder if your extended stay has more to do with my daughter than your injured leg. My orders are to remain here until recalled, Thomas replied calmly. Orders can change. The threat hung implicit in her father's words, especially when concerns about inappropriate behavior are raised. Is that what you're going to do? Report me for protecting a girl from her own father's abuse? A heavy silence followed. Then her father's voice, colder than Eliza had ever heard it. You're playing a dangerous game, Private Jenkins, one you don't understand. I understand more than you think. Thomas's voice carried a quiet certainty that made Eliza's skin prickle with foreboding. James made sure of that. The mention of her brother's name acted like a detonator. Something crashed, a chair overturned perhaps, followed by the sound of scuffling feet and her father's harsh breathing. Get out, he growled. Pack your things and be gone by morning, or I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination and worse. Eliza fled up the stairs before either man could emerge from the dining room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frightened bird. In her room, she paced frantically, thoughts racing. If Thomas left, she would lose her only ally, her only connection to James, her only hope of discovering the truth. Hours later, when the house had settled into uneasy silence, she heard careful footsteps in the hallway. A soft knock at her door revealed Thomas, his expression grave. Your father's asleep, he whispered. We don't have much time. There's something I need to find. The ledger? She asked, stepping into the hallway. He nodded. I think it might be in the attic. James mentioned your father kept important documents in a locked box somewhere in the house. The attic stairs protested beneath their weight, each creak sending a jolt of panic through Eliza's body. The small space smelled of dust and forgotten things, old clothes, Christmas decorations, the remnants of lives interrupted by war. Thomas moved with surprising agility despite his injury, methodically searching through stacked boxes and trunks. Here, he whispered finally, pulling a metal lockbox from beneath a pile of old curtains. It was secured with a heavy padlock, the key nowhere to be found. Can you open it? Eliza asked, keeping watch at the attic door. Thomas produced a small tool from his pocket. Your brother taught me a few tricks, he murmured, working the lock with practiced precision. After several tense moments, the padlock surrendered with a soft click. Inside lay a neatly organized collection of documents, military papers with official stamps, photographs of men in both British and German uniforms, and a stack of letters, some intact, others torn into pieces but carefully preserved. Thomas lifted one of the photographs, studying it in the dim light filtering through the single attic window. My God, he breathed, showing it to Eliza. The image showed her father standing beside a German officer, both men smiling. Her father's hand clasped firmly on the German's shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie. The date stamp on the back read, November 1942, 3 months after James had supposedly disappeared. With trembling fingers, Eliza reached for one of the intact letters. The handwriting was unmistakable, James's flowing script, addressing their father. The date at the top, December 25th, 1942. Christmas Day, 4 months after his disappearance. He knew, she whispered, voice breaking. He knew James was alive all this time. Thomas gathered several documents, tucking them inside his shirt. This is enough to prove your father maintained contact with James well after he was reported missing. The sudden creak of a floorboard outside the attic door froze them both. The door swung open slowly, revealing her father's silhouette backlit by the hallway lamp. His expression was hidden in shadow, but his posture communicated deadly calm. What exactly? He asked, voice soft with controlled fury. Do you think you're doing with my daughter? Dawn broke over London with reluctant light, filtering weakly through the persistent fog that had settled over the city like a shroud. Eliza stood at her bedroom window, watching her father's rigid form escort Thomas down the garden path toward the gate. Their confrontation in the attic the previous night had ended in a stalemate of sorts. Her father had been outnumbered but not outmatched. His cold fury had manifested not in violence but in calculated threats. Official complaints to Thomas's commanding officer, accusations of trespassing and inappropriate behavior with a minor, potential charges of espionage against an allied nation. "You have until noon," her father had pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Pack your belongings and leave this house, or I will ensure your military career ends in disgrace, or worse." Now, watching from above as the two men exchanged terse words at the garden gate, Eliza felt a crushing sense of defeat. Thomas had been her only ally, her only connection to James, her only hope of uncovering the truth. Without him, she would be alone again with her father's escalating rage and the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. The men shook hands stiffly, a facade of civility for any watching neighbors. As Thomas turned to leave, he glanced up at her window, their eyes meeting briefly before he disappeared around the corner. Her father remained at the gate for several long moments, shoulders squared, watching until Thomas was truly gone. When he finally turned back toward the house, his expression was one of grim satisfaction. Eliza retreated from the window, heart pounding with dread. She had seen that look before, the calm that preceded his worst punishments. She moved quickly around her small room, straightening already neat surfaces, a nervous habit born from years of trying to leave no reason for criticism. The floor beneath her creaked slightly as she stepped on the loose board where she kept her treasures hidden, her mother's handkerchief, James's letters, a photograph of happier times, a hollow hiding place that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against her father's methodical scrutiny. The front door slammed below, followed by her father's heavy tread on the stairs. Eliza braced herself, standing with forced stillness in the center of her room. He appeared in her doorway moments later, filling the frame with his broad shoulders and implacable presence. "The American is gone," he announced without preamble. "I've telephoned his commanding officer. He won't be returning." His eyes swept the room, searching for evidence of conspiracy. "Whatever nonsense he filled your head with ends now." "It wasn't nonsense," Eliza countered, surprising herself with her boldness. Fear still churned in her stomach, but something else burned alongside it. Anger, long suppressed but now flaring uncontrollably. "He knew James. He showed me proof that you've been lying about what happened to him." Her father's expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "That man was using you, Eliza. Using you to get to me, to compromise my position." He stepped into the room, reducing the space between them with deliberate menace. "James is gone. Whatever documents or photographs that American showed you were fabricated. I saw James's handwriting," she persisted. "Letters dated months after you said he disappeared." Something flickered behind her father's eyes, calculation perhaps, or a decision being made. "What exactly did your American friend tell you about your brother's activities before his disappearance?" The question caught her off guard, its precision suggesting there was a specific answer he feared. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the front door echoed through the house. Her father's head turned sharply toward the sound, his body tensing like a predator sensing danger. "Stay here," he commanded, backing toward the doorway. "Don't move." Alone, Eliza listened to her father's descending footsteps, then the muffled exchange of voices at the front door. A moment of silence followed, then the door closed, and her father's voice called up with artificial pleasantness. "Eliza, a delivery for you. Come down, please." The forced normality in his tone sent alarm racing through her veins. This was her father's public voice, the one he used when neighbors or officials were present, the voice that concealed the monster beneath a veneer of respectability. She descended the stairs cautiously, fingers trailing along the banister for support. In the entryway, her father stood holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. No delivery person remained. The front door was firmly closed. "This was left at the door for you," he explained, his pleasant expression belied by the coldness in his eyes. "No postmark, no return address. Curious, isn't it?" The package was addressed to her in unfamiliar handwriting. Eliza reached for it, but her father pulled it back slightly, just beyond her grasp. "I find the timing interesting," he continued conversationally. "Your American friend leaves, and minutes later a mysterious package arrives for you." His smile thinned dangerously. "What an extraordinary coincidence. May I have it, please?" Eliza kept her voice steady. though her pulse hammered in her throat. After a moment of deliberate hesitation, he handed it over. "Open it," he instructed, making no move to leave or grant her privacy. With trembling fingers, Eliza unwrapped the package, revealing a small notebook bound in faded leather. Inside, a folded letter had been tucked between the pages. She recognized James's handwriting instantly, her breath catching in her throat. "Read it," her father commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Aloud. Eliza unfolded the letter with reverent care, its creases suggesting it had been read many times before reaching her. She began to read, her voice growing steadier with each word. "My dearest Eliza, if you're reading this, then Private Jenkins has found you, and you now know that I didn't disappear as you were told. I'm sorry for the pain my absence has caused you. What I must tell you now will cause more pain still, but you deserve the truth." She paused, glancing up to find her father watching her intently, his expression unreadable. At his nod, she continued, "I was assigned to investigate corruption within our military intelligence division. Officers selling critical information to the Germans, profiting from the deaths of their own countrymen. My investigation led me to the unthinkable. Father is involved. He's not just a participant, but a central figure in a network that spans both sides of this war. The money, the new furniture, the exemptions from rationing, all paid for with blood." The words struck Eliza like physical blows. Her breath grew shallow, the room tilting slightly around her. James, her heroic brother, the moral compass of their broken family, had been investigating their father for treason. But there was more. As she continued reading, the letter took an unexpected turn. What I couldn't admit to myself at first, what I refused to see, was my own culpability. Father recruited me when I first enlisted, presented it as patriotic work. Controlled information, he called it. Special assignments that would help end the war sooner. By the time I realized what we were really doing, I was already implicated. The transfers I authorized, the reports I modified, all of it made me complicit. I've been trying to gather evidence to find a way out that doesn't destroy us both. But there may be no clean escape from this. Eliza's voice faltered, her vision blurring with tears. The hero in her memory, the brother she had idolized, had been part of the very corruption he later sought to expose. Her soul seemed to crumble inward, certainties dissolving like sandcastles at high tide. James, her protector, her moral touchstone, had been compromised, had participated in something monstrous before attempting redemption. "Keep reading," her father prompted, his voice oddly gentle now, almost sympathetic. "I don't know if I'll survive trying to make this right. Father has powerful allies on both sides. If something happens to me, trust Jenkins. He's a good man, untainted by all this. And know that whatever you might think of me after learning the truth, everything I've done since discovering the full scope of Father's operation has been to protect you and to atone for my mistakes. I love you, little sister. Be braver than I was. James." Silence filled the entryway as Eliza finished reading, the letter trembling in her hands. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the James she'd known, kind, principled, protective, with this new version, fallible, compromised, haunted by his own choices. Had her father coerced him? Had James truly not understood what he was participating in? Or had he known and chosen to look away until the guilt became unbearable? Her father reached out slowly, plucking the letter from her unresisting fingers. He studied it for a long moment, his expression softening into something almost like grief. "Your brother was naive," he said finally, folding the letter with methodical precision. "He didn't understand the complexities of war, the necessary compromises." His voice held a note of genuine regret. "I tried to protect him, to protect you both, from uglier truths." "By lying about his disappearance?" Eliza asked, finding her voice again. "By pretending he was dead? By giving him a chance to extract himself before it was too late?" Her father's eyes met hers directly. "When he threatened to expose everything, I offered him an escape. Disappear, start fresh somewhere far from this war. Instead, he chose a different path. What happened to him?" The question she'd been asking for months, now laden with new dread. Her father's gaze dropped to the letter in his hands. I don't know, he admitted, and for the first time Eliza thought he might be telling the truth. After he sent this, he went silent. No further communications. Without warning, he moved to the fireplace, striking a match and touching it to the corner of James's letter. Eliza lunged forward with a cry of protest, but he held her back with one strong arm, watching impassively as the flames consumed her brother's words. "If you tell anyone what was in this letter," he said quietly as the last fragments turned to ash, "if you breathe a word about James's allegations or your American friend's theories, you will no longer have the right to call this house a home." The charred remnants of James's letter haunted Eliza through a sleepless night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the paper blackening, curling, disintegrating. Her brother's final words reduced to ash and smoke. By dawn, her decision was made. Without bothering to change from her nightgown, she threw on her mother's old coat and slipped out the back door while her father still slept, the morning fog providing welcome concealment as she hurried through the silent streets. She had no address for Thomas, no certainty where he might have gone after her father expelled him. But instinct pulled her toward the small boarding house 3 streets over. Mrs. Kavanaugh was known for taking in Allied soldiers on leave, offering them decent meals and clean sheets at reasonable rates. If Thomas had needed immediate lodging, it was the likeliest place. The elderly landlady answered Eliza's tentative knock with suspicious eyes that softened upon recognition. "Hastings girl, isn't it? Your mother was a good woman. God rest her." She peered more closely at Eliza's disheveled appearance, taking in the uncombed hair, the nightgown peeking beneath the hastily buttoned coat. "You're in some trouble, then." "I need to find an American soldier," Eliza said, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. "Private Thomas Jenkins. He may have taken a room here yesterday." Mrs. Kavanaugh's expression revealed nothing. "And if he has?" "Please," Eliza whispered, desperation cracking through her composure. "It's about my brother. It's important." Something in her plea must have resonated with the older woman. After a moment's consideration, she stepped back from the doorway. "Second floor, last door on the left. He came in late yesterday, paid for a week up front." She caught Eliza's arm as she moved to enter. "I run a respectable house, miss. Door stays open if you're visiting a gentleman's room." Eliza nodded gratefully, hurrying up the narrow staircase. She found the door easily and knocked softly, heart pounding against her ribs like a caged animal. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Thomas in rumpled clothes, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes instantly alert. "Eliza?" Surprise and concern colored his voice. He glanced past her as if expecting to find her father looming in the hallway. "What happened? Are you all right?" Words failed her momentarily. Instead, she thrust James's notebook toward him, the only part of the package her father hadn't destroyed. "He burned the letter," she managed finally. "James's letter. But he didn't find this." Thomas ushered her into the small room, leaving the door ajar in deference to propriety despite the urgency of their situation. The space was Spartan, a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small dresser, but meticulously neat, a soldier's habits evident in the precise folding of the bed covers. "Tell me everything," he said, gesturing for her to take the chair while he settled on the edge of the bed, their knees nearly touching in the cramped quarters. Eliza recounted the previous day's events, her father's satisfaction after Thomas's departure, the mysterious package delivery, the devastating contents of James's letter, the horrifying revelation that her brother had initially been part of the corruption he later sought to expose. As she spoke, Thomas studied the notebook intently, thumbing through pages filled with dates, locations, cryptic notations in James's distinctive handwriting. "This is it," he breathed, a mixture of triumph and grim satisfaction in his voice. "This is what we were looking for on that last mission. James's insurance policy." "What does it mean?" Eliza asked, leaning forward to study the enigmatic entries. Thomas tapped a page filled with columns of numbers and initials. "It's a record of every transaction. Dates, intelligence sold, payment amounts, the initials of everyone involved." His finger traced a recurring set of letters, A.H., that appeared beside the largest payments. "Your father." And here, he flipped to another section, revealing a page of more detailed notes. James documented how the system worked. Senior officers like your father identified valuable intelligence, then used subordinates, often their own family members, to avoid suspicion, to facilitate transfers. Like James, Eliza whispered, the full weight of her brother's complicity settling on her shoulders. Yes. Thomas's expression softened with compassion. But he tried to make it right, Eliza. When he realized what was happening, that the controlled information your father claimed was helping to end the war was actually getting Allied soldiers killed, he turned, became an informant for military counterintelligence. And they sent you with him on that last mission, she concluded, pieces falling into place, to retrieve this notebook. Thomas nodded grimly. We were ambushed. Someone had tipped off the Germans about our operation. His hand moved unconsciously to his wounded leg. I took a bullet covering our retreat. Last I saw, James was running with the documents, drawing enemy fire away from me. His voice roughened with emotion. He saved my life, but he never returned to Allied lines. Eliza prompted, dreading the answer. No, Thomas confirmed. The official report listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. But there was never any confirmation, no body recovered. He met her eyes directly. And now we know your father maintained contact with him afterward. If James is alive, why hasn't he come home? Why send you instead? Thomas's expression darkened. Your father's operation isn't just a few corrupt officers, Eliza. It's an extensive network on both sides of the conflict. High-ranking military officials, politicians, industrialists, people with the power to make problems disappear. He gestured to the notebook. With this evidence, James became the most dangerous man in Europe to a lot of very powerful people. The implication struck Eliza like physical pain. Her brother was alive but unable to return, hunted by forces on both sides of the war, the price of his redemption a lifetime in hiding. Her soul felt torn in two, ripped between family loyalty and moral certainty. Her father, for all his cruelty, was still her father. Her blood, the last remaining tether to her childhood. To expose him would mean destroying what remained of her family, subjecting the Hastings name to public disgrace, acknowledging that the man who raised her was a monster profiting from the slaughter of his countrymen. But to remain silent would make her complicit in his crimes, perpetuating the corruption that had claimed so many lives, betraying James's sacrifice and Thomas's trust. The moral weight of the choice pressed against her chest until breathing became difficult, tears burning behind her eyes. What happens? She asked finally, voice barely audible. If I give you this notebook? If I help you expose my father? Thomas didn't sugarcoat his answer. He'll be arrested for treason. In wartime, that likely means execution. He reached out, hesitating briefly before covering her hand with his own. But it would also mean justice for hundreds of soldiers who died because of information he sold. It would mean dismantling a network that continues to extend this war for profit. And James? If he's alive, this evidence might finally make it safe for him to come home. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. It's the only chance he has. Eliza closed her eyes, James's words from the burned letter echoing in her mind. Be braver than I was. When she opened them again, resolve had hardened her features despite the tears trailing down her cheeks. What do we need to do? We need to get this notebook to military intelligence immediately, before your father realizes it's missing. Thomas stood, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg. There's a secure telephone at the American liaison office. We can call from there. They moved quickly, Thomas gathering his few possessions, while Eliza waited by the door, anxiety climbing her spine with icy fingers. The world outside Mrs. Kavanaugh's boarding house seemed unnervingly normal. Women queuing for rations, children playing in the rubble of a recently bombed building, an elderly man sweeping debris from his shop entrance. None of them aware that just streets away, evidence was being assembled that would shake the foundations of Allied intelligence. At the American Liaison Office, a nondescript building with blackout curtains perpetually drawn, Thomas spoke briefly with the receptionist, showing identification that granted them immediate access to a small office in the back. He lifted the telephone receiver, dialing with practiced efficiency. This is Private Thomas Jenkins, authorization code 47 Alpha Tango 9. I need to speak with Colonel Hargrove immediately. He waited, tension evident in his posture. Yes, sir. I've secured the documentation, have the package James Hastings attempted to deliver during Operation Blackbird. Another pause. No, sir, but I have his sister with me. She has critical information about the network. He handed the receiver to Eliza, his expression gentle but encouraging. Tell them everything. Her hand trembled as she took the telephone, its weight suddenly symbolic of the decision she was making. On the line, a gruff voice asked, Miss Hastings, this is Colonel Hargrove. I understand you have information about your father's activities. Eliza took a deep breath, steadying herself against the desk. The image of her father burning James's letter flashed before her, his final attempt to erase the truth, to maintain his control through destruction. In that moment, her path became clear. Yes, she said, voice strengthening with each word. I need to report a war crime. The military police arrived at dusk, their vehicles pulling up to the Hastings residence with muted efficiency rather than dramatic fanfare. No sirens wailed, no shouted commands pierced the evening air, just the soft crunch of tires on gravel and the synchronized opening of car doors as 6 uniformed men emerged. Eliza watched from the front window, her fingernails digging half-moons into her palms as Colonel Hargrove approached the door, flanked by 2 American MPs and 3 British officers. The knock, when it came, was polite but firm, the knock of men who expected to be answered, who would not be deterred by silence. Eliza opened the door before her father could emerge from his study, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might shatter her ribs. Miss Hastings, Colonel Hargrove acknowledged with a curt nod. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes held a glimmer of compassion as they met hers. Is your father home? In his study, she managed, stepping back to allow them entry. Down the hall, last door on the left. The men moved with practiced precision, 2 positioning themselves at the front entrance, 2 proceeding directly to the study, the others methodically checking the remaining rooms. Eliza stood frozen in the entryway, Thomas's steadying hand on her elbow the only thing keeping her upright as her world collapsed around her. Her father's voice, when it reached her, carried none of the rage she had expected. Instead, it held something worse, calm resignation tinged with disappointment. I assume my daughter is responsible for this, he said, appearing in the hallway flanked by officers on either side. His eyes found Eliza, fixing her with a gaze that contained neither surprise nor fury, but something close to pity. You never did understand what it means to protect family, did you? The accusation sliced through her composure. You call what you did protection? Her voice trembled but held firm. Selling information that got people killed? Forcing James to participate in your schemes? Lying about his disappearance? Everything I did, he replied with chilling certainty. I did for this family, for you, for James. This war was always going to produce winners and losers. I simply ensured we would be among the winners. Colonel Hargrove stepped forward, producing handcuffs with business-like efficiency. Arthur Hastings, you are under arrest for treason against the Crown, espionage, and conspiracy to commit war crimes. The metal clinked softly as he secured them around her father's wrists. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly advise you exercise it. Her father's posture remained rigid, dignified even in disgrace. Only when the colonel moved to lead him toward the door did he resist, planting his feet and turning once more toward Eliza. When this war ends, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, the victors will rewrite history to suit themselves. The lines between hero and villain are drawn by those with the power to draw them. His eyes bored into hers, searching for understanding he would not find. I chose to give my family power rather than leave our fate to the mercy of greater men's ambitions. You chose wrong, Eliza replied simply, the words releasing something that had been coiled tight within her chest for years. As they led her father out, neighbors gathered on their front steps, watching with the avid curiosity of those witnessing a long-suspected truth finally confirmed. Mrs. Fletcher from across the street caught Eliza's eye and nodded once, a gesture that somehow contained both judgment and solidarity. The Hastings family secret was secret no more. Private Jenkins, Colonel Hargrove called, turning back from the threshold. "We'll need your formal statement. Now." Thomas squeezed Eliza's hand briefly. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised, his voice low and private despite the chaos surrounding them. And then she was alone. Truly alone in the house for the first time in her 17 years. The sudden silence pressed against her eardrums like physical pressure, the absence of her father's authoritative presence creating a vacuum that seemed to pull at her skin. She wandered from room to room, touching familiar objects that now seemed like artifacts from a stranger's life. Her mother's knitting basket, James's childhood cricket bat, the family Bible with its meticulous record of births, marriages, and deaths. In her father's study, the drawers of his desk stood open, papers disheveled from the officer's hasty search. Eliza moved toward it as if drawn by invisible strings, her fingers trailing over the polished surface where her father had written his correspondence, made his deals, orchestrated his betrayals. A leather portfolio lay discarded on the floor, its contents spilling onto the carpet, financial records, identity documents, and beneath them, a cream-colored envelope with her name written in James's distinctive handwriting. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, the paper crisp and expensive beneath her fingertips. The seal had been broken, the letter clearly read and refolded. Her father had seen these words, had chosen to conceal them from her. With unsteady fingers, she extracted the single sheet and began to read. "My dearest Eliza," it began, James's voice seeming to materialize in the empty room. "If you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong, or perhaps wonderfully right. I've arranged for this letter to reach you only if Father's activities are exposed, or if I manage to return home safely. Since you're holding it now, I must believe that one of these outcomes has occurred." Tears blurred her vision, forcing her to blink rapidly to continue reading. "I know that learning the truth about Father, and about my own involvement in his operations, must have shattered something precious in you. The faith you had in both of us, the certainty that your family, for all its flaws, stood for something good and true. I am so deeply sorry for that loss, little sister. More sorry than words can express." A sob escaped her lips, echoing in the empty study. "But I need you to understand something essential. In you, I always saw a courage and moral clarity that neither Father nor I possessed. You were never seduced by power or security or status. You saw through Father's justifications, his manipulations, in a way that took me years to achieve. Even as a child, you questioned what the rest of us accepted." Eliza sank into her father's chair, the leather still warm as if it retained some impression of the man who had occupied it for so many years. "It's why I knew you were the only one who could be trusted to bring the truth forward when the moment came. Not me, compromised as I was by my own choices. Not Thomas, an outsider to our family's particular brand of darkness. Only you, Eliza, with your unflinching sense of right and wrong, could cut through the tangle of loyalty and corruption to do what needed to be done." Pride bloomed amidst the grief in her chest. Not the hollow pride her father had insisted upon, tied to family name and reputation, but something deeper and more authentic. Pride in being seen, truly seen, by the brother who had known her best. "I don't know what comes next for any of us," James's letter continued. "I may be dead by the time you read these words. Father may face consequences I cannot imagine. But you, Eliza, you have a future untainted by the choices he and I made. A future where your compassion and courage can build something new from the ashes we've left behind." The letter ended with a simple closing. "With all my love, and with faith in who you will become, James." Eliza sat motionless as twilight deepened into true darkness around her, the letter clasped to her chest like a talisman. Outside, distant explosions punctuated the night. German bombs falling on London's outskirts, the war continuing its relentless progression regardless of personal tragedies or triumphs. Inside, a quieter detonation was reshaping her interior landscape, clearing away the rubble of what had been to make space for what might be. 3 months later, Eliza Hastings pinned her newly issued nurse's cap to her hair with steady hands. The hospital corridors bustled with activity, stretchers being wheeled in from arriving ambulances, doctors calling for assistance, wounded men groaning or crying out in pain. Her first day at St. Bartholomew's Field Hospital should have terrified her, but instead she moved with quiet certainty through the organized chaos. "Hastings, Ward 3 needs extra hands," the head nurse called, barely glancing up from her clipboard. Eliza responded immediately, pushing through the swinging doors into a long room lined with beds. The smell hit her first, blood and antiseptic and unwashed bodies, followed by the symphony of human suffering, ragged breathing, muffled sobs, delirious murmuring. She moved to the nearest bed where a young soldier with bandaged eyes reached out blindly, his fingers trembling in the air. "Nurse?" he called, voice cracking with fear. "Is someone there?" "I'm here," Eliza replied, taking his hand between both of hers. "You're not alone." The words, she realized, were as much for herself as for him. In the aftermath of her father's arrest and subsequent imprisonment, she had declined the offers to stay with distant relatives, choosing instead to apply for nursing training. Thomas wrote to her weekly from his new posting in France, his letters carefully vague about military matters, but increasingly personal in other ways. Of James, there had been no further word. Whether he lived in hiding or had truly perished remained a mystery she had learned to carry without resolution. Yet in this ward, among these broken men who had given so much for causes larger than themselves, Eliza found an unexpected peace. Her hands, once used primarily to cover bruises or clean up her father's messes, now bandaged wounds, administered medicine, offered comfort. The darkness that had defined her childhood, her father's cruelty, her brother's absence, her mother's early death, no longer seemed like the entire world, but merely shadows against which present light burned more brightly. As she moved efficiently between beds, offering water here, adjusting pillows there, checking bandages and recording temperatures, Eliza realized that she had found her answer to James's final question: what comes next? Not redemption through association with her father's disgrace or her brother's attempted heroism, but something entirely her own. A life built on compassion rather than power, on healing rather than harm. When her shift ended at midnight, she stepped outside into the hospital courtyard, tilting her face up to the star-filled sky. The air raid sirens remained mercifully silent, allowing a rare moment of peace in a city accustomed to nightly terror. Tomorrow would bring more wounded, more suffering, more opportunities to push back against the darkness with small acts of kindness and competence. But tonight, for the first time since she could remember, Eliza Hastings stood alone beneath the stars and felt not fear, but possibility. Eliza's journey from victim to survivor reminds us that our destiny is not defined by the wounds others inflict upon us, but by the courage we find to heal ourselves and others. When faced with the devastating truth about her father's betrayal, she chose justice over family loyalty, a choice that required more bravery than most of us will ever know. What would you have done in her place? Would you have found the strength to expose a parent's crimes, knowing it would forever change your life? In the darkest moments of war, Eliza discovered that true redemption comes not from erasing the past, but from creating something meaningful from its ashes. Her decision to become a nurse, to transform hands once used to shield herself from violence into hands that heal, shows us that our greatest purpose often emerges from our deepest pain. Her story challenges us to ask, how might our own suffering become a doorway to serving others? What broken parts of our world are we uniquely qualified to help mend? If this story touched your heart, remember, there are countless real-life Elizas fighting private battles behind closed doors. Share this video to spread awareness about domestic abuse and the courage it takes to break its cycles. Subscribe to follow more stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, and leave a comment sharing what this story meant to you. Because like Eliza, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is bear witness to another's truth.